So I'm Martin Callinan. I work for a company called Source Code Control. We help companies manage what today is referred to as software supply chain. So regardless whether you're developing open source solutions or you're a proprietary software developer, you will be consuming open source components, libraries, frameworks, which can cause...
Can people hear? Or?
Yeah. Which can cause issues. So I'm joined by Joel. I've worked with Joel for nearly 10 years, since they were a startup actually. They got an open source health solution, and we helped them adopt some processes and standards, which I'll talk about in the presentation. So I'm using the theme as software supply chain, which is generally the way software development is referred to today. And this is Open Source 101, so apologies if I'm being a little too simplistic. But basically, you can think of software development today as a supply chain, similar to kind of car production, where you've got these assembly line, and developers are pulling in components and libraries. You know, earlier in the keynotes, all the benefits of open source was verbalized, the ability to share code, not reinvent the wheel. They're all great benefits. So as you get through the supply chain, also, as well as sites like GitHub and package managers that pull in open source code and dependencies, more recently you've got the issue of developers using AI to generate code. And there's been some legal cases and challenges related to the copyright of some of the code that's been recommended for developers. We've got a number of clients in particular who want to identify in their code where developers have used AI, where it's come from, and have they got an issue with copyright for their customers. So when you get to the delivered solution, whatever that is, whether it's software as a service, whether it's an app or a PC application, whatever it is, it will be made up of typically up to 89% other people's code. Okay. And in the keynotes, there's a lot of talk about freedom, you know, the freedom to use open source, but it does come with obligations. Malcolm touched on some of those obligations. And from experience, one of the services we do audits for companies buying other companies and investors investing in tech companies. And from experience, most companies don't understand the obligations of open source licenses and software that is under a license which is perceived as open source, but actually it's got lots of restrictions. And the other issue with all these components and libraries, which a lot of companies aren't good at tracking, is things like version control. And are there security vulnerabilities that you're introducing into your application which you ship to your clients, and you can have an issue downstream? So that's what I mean by software supply chain. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples of security and licensing issues that have happened. So the first one, there's hundreds. We keep a database of companies that have had security issues caused by mismanagement of open source components and libraries. So Log4j, no doubt you're familiar with. A couple of years ago, there's a quite high profile announcement that there's a security vulnerability in Log4j, which is highly exploitable. Log4j is a fairly innocuous piece of code, just as login. We were inundated with customers who didn't know software in their companies did it have Log4j. They were going to their software suppliers and saying, have we got Log4j in software we've licensed from you? And they couldn't get an answer. So we had customers shutting down systems just because they didn't know. And you can see some of the stats about the attacks that are happening on Log4j. There's some interesting stats from sites that share code like Log4j. Developers are still pulling in the vulnerable version of Log4j into their code. So I mentioned we do code audits. The last 5 code audits just before Christmas all had Log4j, all had a vulnerable version of Log4j. And it could be internal package managers are still locked into the previous version, but people are putting in vulnerable code into their applications. And that just one bit of code could cause massive issues for a complex system. So it is important that it's managed. Malcolm touched on some of the licensing issues. We're seeing companies leverage particularly licenses like the AGPL as a strategy to get you to buy a commercial license. So this dual licensing strategy, sometimes referred to as open core. So companies like GoScript and iTex have quite aggressive audit teams. I was in India before Christmas. We got an office in India, and I met with a lawyer, and he just issued cease and desist notices to every bank in India for their use of one of those components. The cease and desist was about non-compliance with the AGPL, but really it was non-compliance with the commercial license. They were using it as a leverage because people didn't want to share their code, particularly banks, to get you to buy a commercial license. So quite often said to me, you don't get legal cases with open source. There's some examples of public domain legal cases, but we do a lot of work with corporates, with legal counsel, and they do get approaches and challenges from software developers, software companies about their misuse of open source, not giving attribution, not sharing the code that they should be sharing and things like that. So one of the cases, Tesla were forced to share their navigation system under duress. So it's an industry group, 2 years of badgering Tesla to disclose some source code, and they didn't do that in the right way either at the end of the day. So there are legal cases. Now, because companies are not very good at managing this, so from experience, try and sell my services into companies, I've never had somebody say no, but I have had said to me quite often, we should do it, but we're busy. We've got deadlines to meet and so on and so on. And because of that kind of attitude, governments are taking action. So it started with the US issued an executive order, which has now become an act. If you supply software solutions to US governments, you have to give vulnerability information. So there's a thing called a software bill of materials, which you can think of like the ingredients on food packaging. So if you've got nut allergy, so whether there's nuts in it, software bill of materials is basically a disclosure of what third-party components or libraries are in your software solution and vulnerability status of those. So version numbers of packages, where they came from, also licensing copyright information. The European Union have ratified the EU Cyber Resilience Act, which is very similar. So the common theme of all these kind of government initiatives are software companies should disclose what's in their code, open source components, libraries, and frameworks. Alongside that, there's industry best practice and standards. So if you want guidance of how you would meet some of those legal obligations, there's a project called OpenChain, which Malcolm's been involved with from the beginning. So it started off as a collaboration of companies with a vested interest to manage open source compliance, and it's evolved into 2 ISO standards. One's security focused, one's license compliance focused. And Joel will talk about that they've adopted both of those standards. And then this thing about software bill of materials, how do you communicate that? So if you look at code on GitHub, descriptions of licenses, for instance, you could have Apache version 2, Apache v2, AL v2, it's all inconsistent, so it's difficult to manage. So there's a kind of formatting standard of how you communicate software bill of materials. So 2 key ones there are SPDX, which is a Linux Foundation project, and CycloneDX, which is more security focused. So if you want to do it, there's loads of reference material on the OpenChain project site, examples, policies, and things like that, and open source tooling. And you can get involved in that. So this is the EU Act, a bit of formatting issue. But basically, you can see this requirement to have a software bill of materials accompany the software that you supply in the European Union. And in 2 years' time, they will start enforcing this with fines for companies who don't comply with that. So if you're shipping devices with software, for instance, IoT devices, there'll be a CE mark, and you would have to have a software bill of materials, not just for your piece of software in the device, but any associated software. For instance, if you've got an embedded device with Linux, you would have to disclose, have you modified Linux and what version of Linux, and all your applications around it. What are the components, libraries, dependencies, licenses, copyright, version numbers, and security status of those components. And you have to maintain that as well. And individual countries, there's some logos across the bottom, individual countries, like the UK government, they're going to bring out something like the Cyber Resilience Act. The Australian government, Canadian governments have all got initiatives in a similar vein. So shifting from we should do this to we have to do this. Okay. So I'm going to hand over to hear about how a customer actually does this and benefits from managing open source.
Thank you, Martin. So my name's Joel Ratnosothy. I'll put this on. My name's Joel Ratnosothy, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself before we talk about how we've worked with source code control and OpenChain projects and our open source software. So I'm actually a doctor by training a long time ago, and I spent some time in academia, and I got very interested in systems. And if you're a systems thinker and you start to think about things like the healthcare service, and the NHS is my main customer, you start to realise that rather than work as an individual within the system, it's much more effective if you can improve it. So I left healthcare. I started working in the tech industry, and I founded Interneuron with my co-founders about seven and a half years ago. Interneuron is a company. We have distributed employees. We work remotely. We have a team in India and around the UK, and we provide open source as a medical device, as a service. And to Malcolm's point, the fact that our code is open source is kind of irrelevant for our customers. Our customers get an Open Modular Care Record. They're interested in prescribing and administering drugs, in capturing patients' vital signs and observations. The fact that the code may or may not have a license that is open source or not is entirely irrelevant to their day-to-day practice. We make our money, and to Malcolm's point, the business model we provide is one of implementation and support. So we get annual recurring revenue for providing a support service with regular updates and patches to maintain the software. So the open source, couldn't agree more, isn't a business model, but you do need to find the right business model to make this work. And there are three things that our customers are really interested in. They're interested in the quality of our software, the safety of our software, and the security. And that's where the last part comes in. But just to touch on quality, so we have a quality management system. We're able that we have to adhere to software as a medical device. That's probably a different talk for a different day. And safety. So safety is really something by design. And I mention safety because one of our solutions, our modules, a prescribing solution, it actually was an open source project by another company. And we didn't take much of their code, if any of their code at all, but we did take their design. So when it comes to the end users and actually delivering benefit, there's more than just the code in some of this open source sharing. There's a lot of a lot of thought goes into design, particularly for things like healthcare and hospitals, where you don't really get an opportunity to build many of these solutions. The opportunities to build new solutions don't come around very often. So taking an existing design and building on it is very important. So security. We heard earlier that governments, are quite, they'll make the decision for the solutions of least risk. Hospitals are exactly the same. There is definitely a perception that there's a phrase that my dad would say when he worked in the tech industry: no one got fired for buying IBM. And that's very true of your average hospital CIO. One of their main considerations is not necessarily innovation. I mean, they do have an agenda and a strategy for innovation, but they don't want to make a mistake. So the more assurance you can give them that what you're doing is safe, is secure, is managed, the more they're going to trust you, the more you're likely to sell your software. So becoming part of the OpenChain standard and being able to provide a software bill of materials to our customer was a real competitive advantage in that sense. So we were able to, when the Lawful.J incident happened, my customers would phone me up and say, is this a security risk I need to worry about? I'm able to confirm the answer is no and send them a software bill of materials so they can see for themselves. So that level of assurance is something that proprietary companies, I'm sure, will have to do at some point. I think that most software, I would agree, is open source software, even if that's not necessarily out in the open. But providing that level of transparency, I think, is a competitive advantage that I see, not only as a differentiator during the sales process, but I see it increasingly being mandated by governments. So Martin mentioned the legislative changes in the US. I'd also see these kinds of things becoming part of the procurement process within the EU. So where these standards are considered essential for public security or public infrastructure and public resilience, mandating adherence to these things as part of the procurement process, I see as something as becoming increasingly common. So Interneuron went on a journey from OpenChain pretty much in the early days, and we worked with source code control. There is a missing formatting issue there. So the first one was education. Yeah. So we went on a journey. So we have to educate our employees. They have to understand why we're asking them to do this. What is the reason for doing it? We trust our developers. Developers work in, we work remotely. They can check in their code. We have code reviews. We do all the things you would expect a sensible company to do. But a lot of code can still be copied and pasted and used and reused, particularly in open source projects. So they have to understand the risks and advantages of doing that in a way that we can manage. And then we develop our own policy. So what licenses can we use? What are compatible? And again, source code control and the products allow us to scan that to make sure that the licenses we have and of projects that we import are compatible with our own licenses. So we're not breaking any of the terms and conditions of the licenses that we state, or indeed we incorporate in our product. So that allows us to get to a point where we can coherently manage our software bill of materials. We're able to reassure ourselves and our customers that if there is a security incident, or if something is reported to us through the scanning of our software, we're able to act on that proactively rather than waiting for issues to happen. And I'm going to probably hand back to Martin in a second, but that essentially is a vignette of our journey. So Interneuron as a company, going through this process, we very much feel that we're ahead of the curve, but we definitely think that the market as a whole is going to move in this direction. I don't know how we're doing for time, but if we have any time, I've got loads of time, so we can take some questions. Martin, if you've got any for Martin as well, that'd be great.
He said the key word. So questions. Question, answer. Question, answer. No comments. No comments. Sir.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, with the OpenChain compatibility, how long did it take you?
The whole process?
Yeah.
Oh, it took us, I'd say, probably from the inception, from the conversation starting to finish, about 3 months. The process itself isn't difficult. It was just, we're a small company. So it was mainly getting everybody on board at the beginning, and as soon as everyone at the top of the company agreed it needed to happen, it was pretty quick.
Right,
Yeah.
There's a question I always get asked about how difficult is it to do OpenChain and it's an ISO standard. We just talked about this previously. We've just done ISO 27001. It took 12 months, but if you read the ISO 5230, it's relatively straightforward. In principle, have you got a policy? So the policy you can think of as a guide for engineers. What licenses are acceptable? How do you manage security vulnerabilities? Have you got roles and responsibilities identified down. So if there's an issue, where do you escalate it to? Who deals with that? Can you identify all the third-party code in your code? So that would be things like software composition analysis tools. There could be multiple tools. There's open source tools, there's proprietary tools. And when you ship your product or deliver your solution, are you meeting all the obligations of the licenses? So the principle is quite straightforward. The other thing is, if you work for a big company, you think, and we've worked with startups all the way to global companies on this. OpenChain is flexible in so much as you can start with one product or one business unit and get that OpenChain conformant and build from there. If you look at the announcements of companies who announce their OpenChain conformant, some companies say we're company-wide conformant, which means every product that they deliver is in line with OpenChain for managing that software supply chain. As regards kind of an approach to it, what we find is there's sketchy or disparate levels of knowledge and perceptions about what you can and can't do with open source. So what we started with Joel is training. Is take everybody through workshop training, get everybody on the same level of understanding and kind of workshop it. And you identify gaps of things that you need to address. And that kind of workshop kind of defines your policy as well. And eventually it becomes business as usual. I mentioned we do code audits. The thing with, if you already established business and you're trying to fix history, it's very, very, very difficult. And people lose faith and give up because it's hard to unpick history. But if you think about starting from scratch, if you start a company from scratch and you did these things, then actually it's quite straightforward. The other thing that's always said to me is, we're too busy, we can't do this. Arguably that's where we can help as a partner. But if you get the processes in place, the policy in place, the education in place and the tools in place, you don't impede any software development. It just becomes part of the development cycle. So you probably heard the term shift left. So if you educate developers about your policy and about what to do, and you've got tools that enable them to identify issues, arguably you can avoid the things in the first place. And if you're building the software bill of materials because you're shipping a new product, really all the data should be there and there should be very few issues to deal with. So if you are looking at this, don't look at, oh, I've got to undo all this history of stuff. Think about how you're going to move forward. What do you want to say?
Yeah, thank you. I have a question. So, we've been talking about like open source and everything, and like everyone has like mentioned community. Like to me, how do you even like build a community, right? So I have an open source project. Is there? Everyone can use it. Wonderful. How do we create that community, and by that matter, who needs to be my community?
We talked about
the developers, the users.
Yeah, I can take this. I mean, so this is a more general question, and I think there's the context of what's your software being used for. So if it's generating revenue, if there's a business aspect to this, then you've got your project is going to live because it's going to get used. If it's not, if it's just open source and someone is maintaining it, that's a sort of social project, right? So you now need to build a community, but presumably you need, for that second category, you're going to need people that use your software to be developers. So there's some great open source projects out there that the users of that software happen to also be engineers. So if it breaks, that they'll use it. So the utility, how useful is your project, is one answer. And then the other is, well, if someone could use that, if someone's willing to pay to use it, then as soon as you've got some sort of business model, which is separate to the licensing model, you'll be able to generate interest, because then people will be drawn to it as a potential source of income. So this depends on the utility. Why are people using your software? I think that would be my answer. Don't know if you want to.
I just echo everything that Joel said, basically. Yeah. Sorry, there's another question.
Like open source, by default, is constantly changing. So I appreciate you've got your education and your policies, but what's your ultimate gatekeeper to show like developer hasn't taken some of the latest stuff to vulnerabilities or whatever into your code? Appreciate audits, but is there tools or what do you use?
Yeah. So the kind of umbrella term for the tools in that space, software composition analysis tools. Some are security focused, some are license focused, some are a bit of both. There's commercial, there's open source. So one of the biggest open source projects in this space, I would say, it's called the Open Source Review Toolkit, which is a suite of open source tools. So it's got a scanner, it's got a vulnerability, it's got a policy checker, and things like that. So what you can do with these tools, so I mentioned having a policy. You say you have a list of licenses that you can't have in your code, a list that you can, and some that need to be checked, and some sorts of process to manage security vulnerabilities. These tools, you can put the policy in the tool. So if a developer pulls in a vulnerable component, they get alerted there and then, or you can alert the security team. If there's a license pulled in which goes against your policy, you can get alerted and deal with it there and then. So you can automate a lot of these things. Some of these tools you can even break a build. So when you're in a build, if there's a security vulnerability or a license that's unacceptable, you can break a build. Some of the security tools are getting really clever. Just because there's a vulnerability advisory doesn't mean to say you're vulnerable, because you might not call the vulnerable code. But some of these tools will look at your code and say you actually are exploitable. So what the complaints about these tools is you get hundreds of reports of vulnerabilities and you research them and none of them are an issue for you. And developers hate that. They're wasting time and going through false positives. So tools now which will prioritise these are the vulnerabilities in your code which could be exploitable. How do you
protect yourself strategically from license changes?
Of the components?
Yeah, of your dependencies.
Yeah, that's a good...
Somebody pulling the rug out from under you, you invested all that time.
So, I mean, to some extent, if you're large enough, you've got expertise. If you're contributing to those components, you have some in-house expertise, you fork that component. You just move away from it. If you're small, you are going to be dependent on a lot of others, but then there's safety in numbers. So if you're using components that are generally used by large companies, then you can be more confident no one's going to pull the rug. But if you're of a certain size, if you're selling support for that, you should really be able to support every component. And then if the license changes, you can fork it because you've gone down that open source route initially.
Yeah, it also depends how big the package you're talking about. So we talked about Elasticsearch and MongoDB. They flip-flopped both ways. That's caused massive issues for our customers. So we had a customer, all their technology is based on Elasticsearch, and then they changed their license. And then Amazon forked it, and it's now become a Linux Foundation project. So that they had to mull, do we stick on that version, which is Apache, but then you're going to get technical debt. Do you, and then maintain that? Do you go down the Amazon route, but you don't know what they're going to do with it? Or do you buy a commercial license? And it caused a lot of issues. With smaller packages, there's a lot of flexibility actually. If you look at components of change license, GPL to Apache, Apache GPL, if you look through the issue logs, you see, I'll give you examples of this, but you want to use a certain component and the license won't work for you, you can contact the maintainer and say, look, we want to use your software, but we can't with that license. Would you consider changing the license? And either they change license for going forward, which we've seen that happen, or they give you an exception and give you a letter saying you can use it under this license. But you do get those license changes, and that's why the importance of tracking the components, because you do get change of license. So for instance, a developer updates a component, it might be automatic update, and the license changes. And so you think you've got Apache and you've got GPL or vice versa. Yeah, it's ongoing battle. So,
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.